South Africa is ruled like an occupied country. Africans have no voice in the government of their own land. To protest is to court arrest, torture, even murder. For 300 years, white men have sought to subjugate Africans. For 300 years, right has always been theirs. Weapons have not.
South Africa, Africa,
Patriots have been shot down, exiled, imprisoned, hanged. Known and unknown, they make up generations of resistance. The black armies that resisted the white invaders in the 18th and 19th centuries fought bravely, but they fought with the weakness of many tribes and not the strength of one nation. By disunity and by the gun, the country was subjugated. But as well as the land, whites needed labor. In 1905, a hard tax was imposed on Africans. To pay the tax, they would be forced to seek work on white mines and farms. The tax would destroy the African economy for the sake of the white. But this was a new generation. One chief, Bambata, refused to pay the tax. He began a guerrilla war. The Patriots could not match superior firepower. The revolt was savagely suppressed. The head of the leader, Bambata, was cut off. The photo became a postcard that British troops sent home to their sweethearts. The whites were triumphant. Bambata's rebellion was the last for 50 years. But victory had not come cheap. And when Africans once more took up arms to claim their country, it would be in the name of Bambata. Political control was now exclusively in the hands of the whites. Blacks, although far more numerous, were still weakened by tribal divisions which the whites sustained. An African leader, Pixley Gaseme, saw the weakness of the African people.
The animosity that exists between the Zulus and the Tongas, between the Basotho and every other native, must be buried and forgotten. We are one people.
Seme called for the formation of a national congress.
The primary object of this organization was to fight against tribalism amongst ourselves, which was the greatest enemy at the time. We found that Dr. Seme discovered that no effort would be successful on our part until we did away with tribalism. We began to regard ourselves as one nation, called ourselves the African people. And that was the real cause of this Congress. It was called primary for that purpose.
In 1912, Selby Msimang was one of the founders of this movement. Called the African National Congress, it would grow into the foremost movement of resistance. The problems were enormous. There were divisions of tribe, of language, of race and of religion, of education, of town and country. All these would have to be overcome if blacks were to have their own nation. Worst of all, there were the whites who would not share power. The struggle was to prove longer and harder than anywhere else. But Dr. Dube said with confidence, where there was once a pool, water will collect again. Within a year of the formation of the ANC came the most devastating blow to African rights. Until 1913, Africans lived side by side with whites. Many of them were prosperous, outproducing white farmers. But these same white farmers dominated Parliament. They passed the Native Land Act, depriving Africans of the right to own land in all but 7% of the country. In the rest of the country, now for whites only, henceforth blacks would be tolerated only as servants and laborers.
The immediate thing that happened was that most of the Africans who lived on European farms got notice, were evicted from them, from the farms they had occupied, because the act itself prohibited an African from owning land, leasing land, plowing, using land on half-share and a half-share system, or even occupying a white land.
Dispossessed, Africans were thrown off land they had worked for centuries. The ANC leader, Pixley Gaseme, said, the African awoke to find himself a pariah in the land of his birth. The Land Act did its job. It destroyed competition from African farmers and guaranteed cheap labor for whites. In over half a century, there has been no move to restore the heritage of the African people.
White people who came to South Africa wanted to own South Africa completely without us. That has been the real grievance amongst our people for a long time. Even now, we do not think South African situation will ever reach a stage where there would be peace in this country until the wrongs done to African people by the Act of 1913 could be righted.
To enter his own country, an African must now show a pass to those who stole it. During the 20s and 30s, a pattern of life was established by whites for blacks, which endures to this day. Economic necessity forced blacks to become migrant workers, living for years away from home. The family unit was wantonly destroyed. The color bar kept blacks at the lowest level of the workforce. As a worker, an African did not have the right to quit or change his job, to strike or form trade unions. Control was exerted through the pass system. Without a pass, an African was not allowed to live or work in a white area. Since there was no work but in the white areas, an African might have to break the law in order to live. The pass book became the symbol of oppression. South Africa's prisons were filled with convicts whose only crime had been to want to work. The ANC campaigned against passes and other issues, but the ANC always worked within the system, believing that whites would eventually be persuaded to accept blacks as equals. There was little to justify such belief. World War II began as a white man's war. The Allies needed black labor for the war effort, but Africans were more threatened by racism at home than in Nazi Germany. After some hesitation, the ANC threw its support behind the Allies, with the expectation that after the war, the democratic ideal in whose name the war was fought would prevail in South Africa. It was not to be. During the war, whites had seen Africans doing work whites had said they were incapable of. The white worker was terrified of black competition, and he had the power to destroy it. In the first post-war election, the white electorate voted into power a group of men dedicated to the complete separation of the races in South Africa, apartheid. The laws of apartheid stripped the African of any hope of equality with whites. Everyone to be classified by race according to tests devised by the government. The shape of a nose could separate a child from its parents for life. Marriage and sex between races forbidden. The entire country zoned by race. From areas designated white, non-whites forcibly removed, their homes, families, livelihoods destroyed. Anyone who threatened white supremacy was considered a communist. By these laws, South Africa became a state committed to racism of a kind last seen in Nazi Germany. In one of the great crimes of this century, millions of people were uprooted from their homes. But there was now a new generation of black activists. Names like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Duma Nokwe, Peter Mda, Anton Lembede. Brilliant and rebellious, they formed the ANC Youth League. The Youth League sought confrontation.
We made it possible for the ANC to accept a very, very militant, very powerful nation-building program. The program of 1949. It is called the 1949 Program of Action. You see. The main demand, you see, in the program of action was that, first of all, there must be recognition on the fact that the African people are the most important factor in the struggle for emancipation for Africa. They being the majority. Yes. So the struggle, therefore, the youth said, must be based on African nationalism, you see. Yes. The assertion of the African people as a people capable of shaping their own destiny.
No longer willing to acquiesce with the system, this new generation launched the Defiance Campaign. The chief organizer was Nelson Mandela. Trained and disciplined volunteers were to disobey unjust laws. Whites-only signs were ignored, curfew broken. As the campaign gained momentum, thousands went to jail, refusing to pay fines. The campaign was peaceful, but later in the year, police fired on demonstrators, killing 33. Savage new laws were introduced against civil disobedience, including whipping. The campaign was crushed. But in the face of the government policy of dividing racial groups, unity had been built across racial lines. The campaign emblem, the Freedom Wheel, had 4 spokes. These were the African National Congress, South African Indian Congress, South African Colored People's Congress, the White Congress of Democrats. ANC membership increased from 25,000 to 100,000. It was the most militant and successful campaign ever run by the ANC. Momentum was maintained, The ANC now decided to bypass the white political monopoly by appealing directly to the masses. A Congress of the People was convened to find out what kind of society the people wanted in South Africa. 3,000 representatives from all over South Africa attended. On the second day, as a provocation, armed police marched in, creating an explosive situation. Instead, all the people stood up together and started to sing their national anthem, Nkosi Sikeleli Afrika, God bless Africa. And while the police were checking documents, article by article, the Freedom Charter was adopted. It remains the basis of ANC policy. This Freedom Charter was used by the government in an attempt to crush the ANC. 156 leaders were rounded up and charged with treason under the Suppression of Communism Act. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, trade unionists, ministers, journalists, all were accused of plotting to overthrow the South African government by force. The evidence was farcical, but the trial dragged on for over 4 years. While it achieved the government's goal of persecution, the accused were severely handicapped in earning a living. It did bring together the leaders of the resistance who proceeded to plan strategy. At least by the accused, the government's case was not taken very seriously, even though it carried the death penalty. When 3 defendants got married on one day during the trial, it was remarked that never in the history of South Africa have so many people accused of high treason gathered together to celebrate the wedding of so many people accused of high treason. Morale was high. Support both within and outside South Africa was enormous. The world focus on South Africa was bad publicity for the white government. Rejecting the government's accusation of a communist conspiracy, the white judges found that the defendants had been waging a non-violent campaign for change in South Africa and were therefore not guilty. At the end of the trial, a jubilant Duma Nokwe said, "Man, this is a night we won't forget in a hurry." He was right. With vindictiveness beyond the call of duty, the political police raided the celebration party looking for whites serving liquor to blacks, forbidden by law. The government had not finished with the ANC. The use of the Suppression of Communism Act to strangle dissent had been clumsy. In future, the laws would be more stringent, enforcement increasingly brutal. In 1956, the Bantu administration, which controls the lives of Africans, introduced passes for women as well as men. For women, passes meant further restrictions on their ability to find work and live with their husbands, greater destruction of family life. With passes, women would be subjected to the same controls and humiliations as their menfolk.
You will stand in the queue at the administrator's offices the whole blessed day. I'm not telling you lies. Some of our mean women even given birth to their babies right in the street. That was our grievances about these pass laws. So it's when these passes came in. So I refused to take one. So I was
Elizabeth Mafikeng of the ANC was one of the leaders of the anti-pass campaigns that swept South Africa. For a while, women bore the brunt of the struggle. Thousands were arrested.
You may be in bed with your husband late in the evening at about 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock. The police will just come and knock at your door, asking for a pass. Taking the women, taking your daughter to different cells. What's going to happen? The police itself is going to rape you with your child there. So that is what we could not stand.
The women would not be silenced. The authorities cracked down. Mrs. Mafeking was to be exiled to a desert where she would have no means of support for her family.
A woman with 11 children. How can you send her really to the desert? Will she ever be able to live there with these 11 children? Because I didn't want to leave my children behind.
Mrs. Mafeking fled the country, taking her family with her. She had never received a trial.
I couldn't have run away. I couldn't have run away from my birth country. If there was a law, I could have served my sentence. But there was no chance for me.
In the countryside, women demonstrated against repressive laws. Getting no response, they set fire to cane fields. Over 1,000 women were arrested, and there were some deaths. In Cato Manor, a ghetto outside Durban, women complained of their husbands' inadequate wages and the lack of electricity. Their grievances came to focus on the white-run beer halls, where the men spent their money instead of on the home brew. Home brew was made by the women, was more nutritious, and was a traditional source of income. The women led a boycott against the beer halls, chasing the men away. The beer hall boycott was broken in a police charge that killed 2 people. The police made several swoops on Cato Manor in search of home brew. Many people were arrested. The people would take it no longer. On one of their raids, the police were surrounded by the people, demanding release of the prisoners. When the police refused, the people set the prisoners free, killing 9 policemen who tried to stop them. That was in January 1960. During that year, the police felt a special need to fear and seek vengeance on Africans. The great civil disobedience campaigns of the 50s were on a scale never before seen in South Africa. But white power was able to outmaneuver every black protest simply by outlawing it or crushing it with Saracen armored cars. The constant frustration led to the birth of a new organization, the Pan-Africanist Congress.
And we therefore felt that our program of action should not depend on the government of the day. It should emanate from the African people themselves. It was with this background that the Pan-Africanist Congress had to be formed in 1959.
Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe was the founder of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Sobukwe's PAC stressed African nationalism and taught black consciousness long before that term had been coined. Sobukwe promised action. As a target, the PAC chose the passbook, which dictates where an African may live and work. For not holding proper passes, Africans have been arrested in their millions. The PAC plan was for all Africans to deliberately seek arrest for not carrying a pass. On March 21st, 1960, Sobukwe was among the first to march to the local police station. The slogan of non-cooperation was, "No bail, no defense, no fine." At Sharpeville, a small town outside Johannesburg, a huge crowd gathered at the police station. At point-blank range, the police opened fire. Of the 69 children, women, men killed that day at Sharpeville, the majority were hit in the back. The police had continued to fire even when the crowd was fleeing in panic. That same day, after word of the massacre was out, police shot and killed demonstrators at 2 other locations. Provoked by police violence, black anger now erupted throughout the country. By the end of the week, factories were at a standstill. Maids did not report for work, and whites had to do jobs they were not accustomed to. Among whites, the inconvenience induced a sense of siege. A state of emergency was declared. In a massive show of force, Saracen armored cars and the army were called in. The ANC and PAC banned outright. Leaders including Sobukwe, arrested, exiled, driven underground. The police had free rein to destroy all opposition. People were whipped out of their homes and forced back to work under the guns of the army. Open-air politics ceased. Government intolerance of dissent created the underground resistance.